Välkomna till Folkets Radio, idag med Maren Morgan och Jake Marquez. They run the excellent podcast and Substack blog Death in the Garden with essays, interviews and a documentary project. So first of all, very welcome.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, this is exciting. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, it's been a long time coming. I got introduced to your work by farmer and activist Jörgen Andersson, whom I have interviewed on this channel about regenerative agriculture and the problems that he sees with the so-called sustainable agriculture and the UN and the big corporations, which is called Agenda 2030. So you have addressed this topic as well, but not only from an agricultural point of view, but also from a philosophical, mythological, and spiritual, basically asking whether industrial civilization can ever be sustainable and meaningful. So I wonder if we could just start off by, you wrote in an email that your documentary project came about as a reaction to a dietary journey where you thought veganism would be a great solution. So maybe that would be a good place to start by giving the background and explaining also perhaps how this name came about, Death in the Garden.
Absolutely. Yeah, in many ways, this project began with a journey I took a number of years ago. And with the rising awareness of the unsustainability of modern society comes the modern solutions for those problems. Mm-hmm. So in modern culture and in the zeitgeist, there are kind of these commonly believed solutions to all of our problems. Mm-hmm. On shorthand, it's veganism, renewable energy, conservation efforts, sustainable technologies, things like this. And so as like a young man, kind of in my early 20s, hearing about this veganism aspect as a solution to kind of this struggle and angst and anxiety that I was having as a kind of a young man who was aware of much of the problems, having something come across my sphere such as veganism or plant-based diets, which were so heavily marketed a number of years ago. There's a stream of Netflix environmental films, and it's very much been entered into the zeitgeist of awareness is that plant-based diets go significant ways on protecting the planet and the environmental destruction that industrial agriculture is doing. And a lot of the original premises of that kind of concept really took me in my early 20s. And long story short, I spent a number of years really being involved in the plant-based movement, and it ended up with me living in a intentional vegan community in the middle of nowhere, Australia, living out of a tent where there was anywhere from 50 to 70 young people growing their own food, living this vegan lifestyle, doing yoga, being very intentional. And it was great for a while. It was a very fun journey, but my health ultimately failed because of this diet, which was at the time, a very confusing and frustrating and sad thing. Because when my health failed from the vegan diet, and I began reintroducing animal foods back into my life and kind of having this bodily awareness that, oh, wow, yeah, there was something very wrong for me as an individual with that diet. And so what does that mean for me as somebody who no longer is living a plant-based lifestyle? How do I take care for the planet? How do I have animal ethics? How do I walk on this earth? Because it kind of, that lifestyle is supposed to give you all the answers. And it's, so when you then have to still, people go plant-based for a number of reasons or vegan for a number of reasons, planetary health, human health, animal ethics, and the quasi-fourth reason, a spiritual sense of spirituality, higher vibration connected with life type deal. And so as somebody who still had all those intentions for my life in the world, but then beginning to eat animal products, it opened up this kind of philosophical inquiry that I had to go on, honestly. And so for me, that was kind of my impetus for wanting to make a project. And I'm sure Maren has her reasons why she wanted to go on this journey. But for me, it was needing to answer that question of, oh no, things die for me to live now. When I consume something dies, and there's a life-death interaction that's happening. But when I began that journey and I began looking at all food and all agriculture and all life on Earth, I kind of ran into this even deeper philosophical thing of, wow, all life, no matter how small or big or complex, requires death. And that's kind of one of these core fundamental laws of life, of the universe. And so wanting to explore this kind of understanding that I was getting, that there was no way of escaping that reality. There was no way of something not needing to die for me to live, whether that was a plant or an animal. And so when I began to look at the food system through that lens, when I began to look at human societies and how we've structured and the impetus for how we've structured civilization through maybe this death-denying attempt to control nature and to dominate nature and to need to, in our deep anxiety around death, we have created a society that at its core is really trying to control nature. And the ultimate vision of that culture is to eventually have no death. It's a death-free world. We've either uploaded our consciousness to machines, or we have found the secret to aging and we never die. But through our hyper fixation on science, one day we're going to abate death. That's the story we're being told. So kind of wanting just to change my diet, but having really good intentions led me down this longer philosophical inquiry of what are we actually doing here as a species on Earth, and is there some sort of core fundamental story that's being told?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the philosophical bit of it really kind of came in through paying attention to death, paying attention to the way the culture talks about death. It's through our research we found the very first piece of human literature that was ever written in cuneiform in like Sumeria was Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's all about grief and death and like how to come to terms with death and how that feels and how bad it feels. And so it's this conundrum that humans have been facing since we don't know when the sort of light switch clicked on and we started really being aware of this fact. And we can look back and you can see that, funerals began to be more of a thing around a certain period of time, especially, but we're limited as far as archaeology goes. So we really have to kind of bring it into the present moment. And, you think about things like the elixir of life and, even the sorcerer's stone in Harry Potter, like there's so many stories that are ambient in our culture that are all about trying to deny death. And so that was something that we just sort of ran with right at the beginning. We just sort of knew like, okay, I have an anxiety about this. Like you have an anxiety about this. Maybe we should interrogate that anxiety. And so then Death in the Garden as a title came sort of intuitively. So yeah, it's a very complex project, but it really did start with this sort of epiphany moment that Jake had eating a rotisserie chicken. And he was like, oh my God, what like I have to figure out how to make sense of all of this.
So I'm hoping we can in a short while return and go deeper into this, what it is in our culture which is seriously flawed, not only in when it comes to the approach to death and also with the need for control and these things you bring up. But I wonder if you could just address this topic of regenerative agriculture. You say that you wanted to show how amazing it answered so many of the questions that veganism claimed but failed to answer.
Yeah, regenerative agriculture right now is it's an interesting topic for the two of us, because when we began the film, we really wanted to highlight regenerative agriculture, because a few years ago when we started the film, regenerative agriculture, before it really kind of started to begin to hit pop culture, was a much smaller, insulated thing. And so for a whole year, we kind of went from regenerative farm to regenerative farm to regenerative ranch. Like we really met a lot of regenerative practitioners, particularly people who are using animals on the land to regenerate. And so on one hand, we were confirmed that, wow, yes, regenerative agriculture is real. The real true ethos and the story that's trying to be told by regenerative agriculture practitioners, which is, hey, let's become one with the land in the sense that we can live in this place and it becomes a little bit more fertile than when we first got here. It got more beautiful, it got more biodiverse. That's very much real. But then on one hand, as the years rolled on, we saw a trend happening with regenerative agriculture, which is what happens with any good intention, is that the dominant story begins to absorb this new thing, almost as if it's a threat. It recognizes it as a threat to the dominant paradigm. And instead of going out to war with this thing, it begins to adopt the language. And it kind of makes the language a little bit neutered and meaningless. Right now, you can get on Cargill or PepsiCo or whatever these big agricultural corporations, and you will see that they are using regenerative practices. They are using holistic, you will hear these terms begin to be absorbed, but kind of intentionally made meaningless. And so there's this fire within us to want to really protect and define what regenerative agriculture really means before it kind of becomes meaningless, just kind of like organic, like organic in a sense is a kind of a meaningless term at this point. Like, because what regenerative agriculture really is has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with putting food in the grocery store. What it really has to do with is humans returning to a sense that we eat out of an ecosystem, that we are part of an ecosystem, and that if part of your existence doesn't have some sort of awareness of the place in which your food and sustenance and livelihood comes from, and if you are not in a relationship that is making that thing better and more protected and thrive more, then you're probably telling yourself a stupid story. If you're not doing that. And so for us, that's what regenerative agriculture really means. And I would love for you to add on to that.
Yeah. I mean, like it's so hard. It's so challenging because there's so much a part of me that really does believe that regenerative agriculture is part of the solution. Regenerative agriculture, agroecology, whatever you want to call it, it is the solution. But what is happening is that it is being treated as a program to add to the capitalist economy, as much as anything else. And it's exactly what Jake was saying, that it's so easy for these types of things to be co-opted and turned into a mechanistic thing that you do on the land to keep your soil healthy enough to keep producing, to keep maintaining the same sort of industrial system. And so that's the place where we've sort of been like, there's the vision that's actually at the center of what I think someone like Alan Savory believes, or what we've talked about this sort of thing with Jürgen before. We've talked about this with other friends that are in the regen movement. The vision that's at the center of it has to be protected, and it also has to be integrating the fact that it is derived, the methodologies and the awareness is derived from like ancient pastoralist cultures and indigenous cultures. And so there needs to be an invitation of all of these different points of view into regenerative agriculture. It can't just be a prescription of how you run your cows through your landscape. It has to be deeper than that. And it's a little bit hard sometimes, like us saying that as like non-farmers who obviously are interested in farming. But, at the same time, we have gone into this project as journalists who are really trying to learn from our subjects. And that's the kind of thing that we kept noticing, is that what is so easily co-optable about regenerative agriculture is the same reason that veganism is so popular, is it offers us salvation. If you can go to your grocery store and not really fundamentally change anything about your life and purchase a package of meat or a plant-based sausage and think, okay, today I did my best. I did the thing that I need to do in order to make the world a better place. We are shirking our responsibility to the deeper, more philosophical and just more human questions that we need to be asking about what is the direction of our civilization going? Do I want to have this grocery store mentality where I just go and I have no idea where my food comes from? Or like, I'm buying meat that comes from New Zealand when there is actually a farmer in my community that could use my dollars instead. Like, these are questions that I think are really important for people to answer. And if regenerative agriculture just gets co-opted as another organic or just another thing to buy, it's not a solution, because it's not interrogating the fundamental problem of this ecocidal, suicidal culture. I mean, you shared with me the foreword to your book, and you have this great Derek Jensen quote. Right. And I think that's really what we're getting at too, is it's like there's no solutions so long as we take for granted the teleology of our civilization. And I think that it's like we're not at a place where we can take that for granted. Right. The regenerative agriculture in that sort of form as like a scaffold to capitalism, it might be useful for a time, but we need to as a species, we need to be getting back into the awareness that we are part of ecosystems. And so I see that as being something that could be useful, but more likely it's going to be corrupted pretty easily. And so, yeah, bringing things back to the local, bringing things back to the contextual, bringing things back to the community level is from our point of view, like the most imperative part and the most beautiful potential that regenerative agriculture has.
Yeah. And Jürgen, when I interviewed him, he talked about that a lot of people have been vegans, and when we have got to know them, and then they sort of see that veganism is not the solution. It's actually, and I think you also say that it can be also used in a way to forward very sinister agendas. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do want to comment like on it's been kind of funny. Actually, I would say it might be disproportionately more people who we've met who are now like pastoralists and shepherds were formerly vegans rather than not having been a vegan. We've met so many people who have gone on the vegan journey and then kind of come full circle. We always say this is that I think every vegan ends up eventually becoming a non-vegan, but the most important thing is that you kind of leave eating animal products and then you come back, but you're a different person. And there's no way of going back to like the kind of unconscious meat, it's like you have to look at the industrial system and you come back to eating it, but then you're like, you have no other choice to become a shepherd or, to get close to your food, which is something really funny we've noticed. And then also that, the narrative creating around the plant-based diet, just that term plant-based, you can see it on every packaging nowadays. So there's these foods that maybe 10 years ago would have just been labeled as like cheap candy fast food, but they now have plant-based stamped on them. So on one hand, it's like, okay, yeah, all the ingredients for this food product are technically came from plants. Doesn't mean it's good for you. They're all hyper chemical processed and filtered and sifted and reduced. They're just as toxic. But also that there is a lot to be gained from a global transition to essentially industrially produced plant foods. Plant foods have the lowest cost to produce and the highest ratio to sell at. So a company can sell something, or it'll take them 1 cent to buy it from a farmer, but they can sell that for $1, so on and so forth. So what costs 5 cents to make, the processing fee to go through their factories and make it into rice puffs or whatever it is, they add the processing fee, which is up to like 1,000% sometimes on these foods. So the profit margins is really nice for this global shift. There's actually very little money to be made on meat. Anybody who grows meat, even industrially, is going to tell you like it's really, really hard to make it a viable, high income. That's why we do it in the factory farm system, because you need those yields. You need the yields, otherwise it becomes untenable. Most farmers we know who raise animals, it's a very hard business to be in. So to shift away from that just makes the economy far more efficient. So there's kind of the corporate economic aspect of this is a great money play, but there are true like deep societal ideological gains to be had here. One, our culture has the death-denying phobia, but there is religious beliefs that have essentially created the global dietary guidelines far and wide. And that's a history we can get into if you want, but it is a deep history about how the Seventh-day Adventist Church has done an incredible job at making sure the dietary guidelines that were created originally in the United States in the 1970s have essentially been exported everywhere in the world. Most likely your dietary guidelines in Sweden have been heavily influenced by this one religious group. It's a very interesting history, and at that core of that religious group is the Garden of Eden diet, is needing to purify the earth so that the second coming of Christ can happen. And part of that purifying of the earth is a plant-based vegan diet.
And it sounds super conspiratorial, like it sounds kind of crazy. And I would just add on that it's like, I think most people who are vegan today have no idea about this history.
Yes.
And they're doing it for all of the reasons that Jake outlined, which is that they want to save animals and they want to, they want to protect the planet. They hear these figures that, cattle are the most destructive force on earth and that they're producing so much methane that they're causing climate change and all of these things. And, they see the videos of these slaughterhouses and they just feel horrified. And the thing is, factory farming is a brutal system that we should not continue under any pretenses. We have to move away from that, absolutely. But I think what people have a hard time, and this is something that I've also had a hard time with, is that we live in a really insane time of human history where we have to consider like a global understanding of things, which means that there's going to be a lot of contradictory information that you have to kind of hold in your brain, and the complexity of all of that is really challenging to hold. But the thing that we really are trying to highlight in our project is the importance of self-determination. And up in the highest echelons of society, the World Economic Forum, the UN, there are forces at play that are trying to instigate a global planetary diet. And they make this seem like it's very benign and it's very innocuous, and it's about giving people access to health, protecting the planet from the horrors of factory farming, and all of these things. Like they sound good. But when you actually look at the guidelines that they're creating, they are industrial foods that they're promoting more than anything. They want you to eat plant-based foods. They don't want you to have a garden and grow your own food. They want you to eat from the industrial food system. And this is something that has been the global powers have been struggling to do, is to create this global economy where we're all so entwined and interconnected and dependent on it that we are forced to be a part of it. There's a reason why there's so many efforts to sedentarize pastoralists, and that's been happening for hundreds of years. There's a reason why they're doing that. They want people to be dependent on the system. It's very profitable. It's also just easier to control people. It's really easy to be an unruly society. There's like this sort of idea that more than like the Great Wall of China wasn't necessarily built to keep the Mongols out, but rather to prevent the people who had been sedentarized to seeing the Mongol way of life, because they may want to leave and be a pastoralist and be free and have this liberty that when you're encased in the state society, you don't have. So it's really important to consider this sort of thing when you look at the, it's called the Eat Lancet Commission is what created the global planetary diet. And the people who created it, they're outspoken vegans. One is a Norwegian billionaire. The other is a doctor, or he's like a professor and
an epidemiologist at Harvard who's been very paid for by the industrial corporations.
Yeah, and he's, more than anything, he's just like he has an agenda and he has an ideology. But one thing that I've been finding really interesting and really important to highlight is that they make a point to say in this report that in sub-Saharan Africa, which I think most people are aware, suffers from malnutrition more than almost anywhere in the world. They are making the point to say that their diet is they eat plenty of meat. They're within the parameters of how much meat a person can eat, but they're eating way too many tubers. It's like, why are they concerned about the amount of tubers that they're eating? And instead they're saying these people need to be eating more nuts and beans and grains. Those are industrial foods. You can't grow those in your backyard. You can grow yams and potatoes in your backyard and feed yourself. You can have livestock to feed yourself.
And on a note, just to add to this is a demographic of the human population who's doing pretty well health-wise and has managed to live in a place for a very long time off of their own food culture.
Yeah, and the malnourishment that we see majority of the time is like I think this is really important to just say, is that hunger is a political issue. It is not, has nothing to do with actual amount of food that we're producing. However, these forces that there's a commonality in the forces that want us to adopt this industrial globalized diet. They want to convince all of us that the world is running out of food, and it's not. It's that we have created this society that is predicated on this capitalist system where everybody's getting poorer all the time, and like a handful of people are getting richer all the time. The world is becoming increasingly more challenging to live in because of this system. And so the people who are suffering the most from it, they are like, the reason why malnourishment exists is because they can't afford food, because they have been forced into the economy and forced into smaller and smaller and more marginal lands, and they have had their livestock taken away. They've had their means of like providing sustenance for themselves taken away systematically by this culture, and that's why they're starving. It's not because we need to be producing more food, but that's the mythology that keeps being spread. And what that's going to cause is a global population of really hungry and really unhealthy people that are also therefore dependent on the pharmaceutical system. And, the merger between Monsanto and Bayer is like a pretty tidy illustration of the fact that these two institutions are in relationship with each other. And we should be really, really cognizant of that, that these movements are happening in our society.
Yeah, I think maybe you just answered my next question. You used this word corporatocracy. I love this word. I don't think we have a good Swedish translation, that the world is ruled by a corporatocracy. How would you explain what a corporatocracy is?
Well, if you think about it, the beginning of colonization of the European colonization of the world, it didn't start, it began a little bit with Columbus recognizing that, when he landed in the New World, that this age of discovery happened. But what really happened, what really set colonialism off was the creation of the corporation. And it began with the Dutch East India Company going to Indonesia and colonizing that land and basically turning it into a plantation of spices to be able to send back to Europe and to make a ton of money. The British followed suit. Shortly after, they created their colonies in the United States, the Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company, to grow tobacco and cotton and things like that. Shortly after that is when slavery was instituted. The transatlantic slave trade began. But over a period of time from around like the mid 1500s to like basically when these actual more formal colonies began to be created, which was like in the mid 1800s, all of the colonies were operating not necessarily under a flag, but under a corporation. They were sponsored by governments, and but they were really sponsored by private individuals that were paying to be shareholders in whatever corporation. And so this created a society of one, like a white Western infiltration and colonization into the rest of the world. But this importation of a very particular type of like existence, which is the sort of plantation monoculture agriculture system. And this, laid waste to landscapes all over the world. And all of the populations of people in those areas were enslaved to participate in this empire building. So that was sort of where it started. It was like 400 years ago. The economy started becoming this very specialized thing where it was like you convert an entire landscape in tobacco in one area. And then over in Sri Lanka, you have an entire landscape that's been converted to tea, or, wherever you want to kind of look, is like this sort of system has been instituted. And it's the exact same system that we have today. But what's crazy about it is that, for example, I just read recently that in England, they produce and export as much beef as they import. Why would a country do that? Why would a country want to export their food only to have to import the exact same product, right? If you look at all trade in the whole world, it's essentially that same kind of like mind-bending kind of like doesn't make any sense. It's the same thing with soy in the United States. Like we import so much soy and we also export so much soy. And it's like, why are we doing that? And I think that the simplest way to understand that is that the corporate class of our society has taken over and monopolized and consolidated almost entirely. Every single aspect of our society is predicated on the maintenance of this system, and it's not even so simple as to say that capitalism is the problem, because and I think that our definition of capitalism is more about like the action of commodifying. Yeah. And turning into capital things and then exchanging those things. But really what we're seeing is that the government sponsorship of corporations hasn't changed in 400 years. That's still how our systems work. That's still how the world is ran. And so really what it is it's a socialism for the corporations, capitalism, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps for everybody else. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm talking about, the United States is different as far as like our structures than Sweden is, but fundamentally, the whole world has been brought into this capitalist homogeny.
Yeah.
And what this corporatocracy is very good at is deception and make-believe, co-optation of important movements, as you said, and making something extremely destructive look like the way to save the planet. So how did you become aware that the climate agenda is also being used for very cynical purposes?
Well, I think it was as we were looking at the food system and we began to get the sense that we were like, okay, I think I can see the food system for what it is in a larger sense. I think our brains naturally started thinking outside of the box as well. It was like, well, what are the other so-called solutions? Veganism is just one of the answers we're given. The other one is renewable energies. Like if we can just make the renewable energy transition. And so we started thinking about that with the same lens of, if the solution came from the same thinking that caused the problem, is it a solution at all? And I think when we talked to Derek Jensen as well, he said that great line, what are the so-called solutions to climate change have in common is they take industrial civilization as a given. And that industrial civilization as a given part was the part that we really had to, wow, okay, our renewable energies, what are they for? Well, the premise behind renewable energies is that we get to keep our lights on. We get to keep this lifestyle going. So we're just going to transition because the ultimate given is that civilization keeps the lights on. That's the big given. So we'll do anything. And then as we began to look at like, okay, well, how are solar panels made? How are windmills made? Like, what are the negative externalities that nobody is talking about? And so it was like, oh, what do they make wind blades out of for these windmills? Well, they make it out of balsa wood. Where does balsa wood come from? The Amazon jungle. So on one hand, the vegans and people who want to have all these solutions will say, meat is cutting down the rainforest, but then they'll cut down the rainforest for the windmill. Or we discovered in northern Sweden and Norway as well that, I'm sure you're very well aware, and it's probably a very contentious topic within Scandinavia, is the infringement upon Sami lands. These last places where they can widely graze their animals are having huge windmill parks put in. They're having huge copper mines put in so that Oslo can have power. Oslo can have renewable energy. And it's, okay, well, it's kind of the same story told again and again. Here's a culture who has been in this place for a very long time, has been able to feed themselves for a very long time in one place, but for the sake of another culture who hasn't quite seemed how to be sustainable on the earth is going to have their life way taken away. And obviously these are all very nuanced and tricky topics in their own right. But this general theme of, so when you see that in the renewable energy, there's also the conservation movement. If we can just protect nature, let's put a fence, let's decide what nature is, and let's put a fence around it. Our generation grew up with the World Wildlife Fund and David Attenborough documentaries, and they're all about like nature is out there, there's little pockets that are remaining, and we need to do our best to keep it alive, and we can go be tourists. It's like a zoo. We'll just put a fence around it and we'll see nature. But as long as we can protect a bunch of tigers and a bunch of lions and a bunch of elephants, nature will be saved. And we're going to pick just the animals that are best on the camera. And that's the only animals that get it. Everything else can just go to shit. And so you find the same thinking in the conservation movement where it's nature is separate, and ecosystems are separate. We're not part of that thing. We can protect it. And any human who's part of that ecosystem needs to be pushed out. Right now, the Maasai communities are in the news a lot because while creating a lot of these national parks owned and operated by Western NGOs are pushing African indigenous people off of land they've inhabited for a very, very long time. So that we can put a fence around it and Westerners in their plastic jackets and tents can go camp and take photos with their nice equipment of the last remaining lions and whatnot. So we began to, please feel free to fill in here, that like asking, is this in the service of the same narrative, the same cultural mythologies and assumptions that caused the lack of nature to begin with? We began to notice those things popping up, and these things became far more as non-solutions.
Yeah. And we've kind of gotten to this place where it's like if there's a colonial agenda at the root of any of these solutions, it's never going to be a solution. It's always just going to cause more problems than it solved. And so, if you're Bill Gates and you're funding, movements in Africa to basically bring in like high-tech Monsanto GMO agriculture into Southern Africa, and it doesn't work because it's not, and it hasn't been for 17 years. This is the AGRA, which is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa that I'm talking about. Like that, the idea that there needs to be an imposition of this culture that has been causing so much destruction for a very, very long time onto other communities, and being like, we're going to civilize you, we're going to develop you, we're going to bring you into the developed world. I think we need to ask ourselves, like, why would we want to do that? Why is that something that we want to do? Why can't we fathom or hold space for the notion that maybe part of what makes the Earth community of individuals and humans so incredible is the diversity and the contextualization of the way that we live our lives. Reindeer herding or following reindeer in the Arctic, it provides an inherent ecosystem function. It provides a very necessary aspect of food sovereignty, more so than the importation of resources from all around the world. But it's the same thing here. Like our people, killed off all the bison, and so then we had to bring all these cattle in. But then we still have this system of being trapped within a corporate class, being trapped within this industrial economic system that doesn't benefit anyone. And so it's like we're all being sort of siphoned into this one way of life that I would argue no one really likes that much. Like, I think maybe a handful of people do, but a lot of people maybe don't have the language to understand that, that they're taking all of these antidepressants and they're taking anti-anxiety medicine, and they just think that's kind of normal. But from our point of view it's like, we need to stop thinking that this is normal and that we're okay with this, because we've lost so much in the pursuit of this one way of life. Right. And so, we're just trying to really interrogate those sorts of ideas. Right. Sorry, I got a little bit lost in a tangent there, but
no, it's very interesting. You keep returning to this word, our culture. And I think it's sometimes very hard to see it, because it's like this joke, one fish is telling the other there's something's wrong with our water, and he goes, "What water?" So we're swimming. Yeah. But I think if we want to go to the core, what's really wrong with our culture, it's even beyond the corporatocracy. It's something which goes even deeper. I just wanted to read you a short quote from the Bible. It says like this: "And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish and sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." That's quite a departure from the indigenous way of life, isn't it?
Well, I just wanted to say, we spoke to a friend of ours, and, we talked about this quote, because I think what's really interesting about the Bible is that it's a translation. It's been translated so many times, and it was originally, especially the first 12 books of Genesis, it was brought down from an oral culture. And so, that word dominion, I think, has been really, really latched onto by our culture. But what our friend said is that if you look at the actual Hebrew word that's being used there, it's much more about stewardship and relationship. It's a much more reciprocal kind of actual word, rather than this dominion, which is we are in control, we have the power to subdue and control nature. The Hebrew, there's a lot of mistranslations in the Bible, but which has led to our culture having that point of view.
But regardless of the mistranslations, I think the important thing to talk about as well, and I think modern humans and modern people from modern Western society have a hard time conceptualizing that we do still have stories we tell ourselves. I think we're very convinced that as modern, rational, science-believing humans who live in a world that's created by science, that we no longer are subdued to mythologies and narratives and stories as our primitive ancestors did. We no longer have gods and we no longer have mythologies, which is very untrue. It's very fascinating when you begin to learn that, you have to ask yourself, what are the defining qualities that separate humanity from the rest of web of life? That doesn't make humans better or more deserving of power over the rest of web of life, but what makes us different? And it's the fact that our species has an incredible capacity for two things, a lot of things, but two things primarily: technology and culture. It's how humans operate, is that we have a culture. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what is culture? And culture is a set of stories people tell themselves on where they came from, where they are, and where they're going, and how to be in the world. And cultures define what kind of technologies arise. And those technologies reinforce the culture, and it's kind of this circle reinforcing thing. But they're very intertwined with each other. And so it's impossible to be human and not have a culture. It's in a similar way, it's hard to have a laptop that doesn't have an operating system. It's not going to work. Like, you need something to use all the mechanics in a way that makes it coherent to you. In the same way, you need a story that makes the world make sense to you. It tells you what to do every day, who to be, how to treat other people. And we still have just as many narratives as we used to from the first time we became humans that we do now. Part of the stories is that we don't have a story. But this story is just as ambient and imbued in our everyday life as it always has been. And so I'm glad you're pointing to this Bible story, because whether you're a religious person or you know anything about the Bible, the Genesis story is still at the very core of modern society. I don't care how enlightened and rational and liberal your society is. That story, that epistemology, we love this word, epistemology. What is epistemology is essentially what is your operating system. And if you get to the core of modern, lefty, rational society, you still have the Garden of Eden story. You still have the basic lessons that are preached through the mistranslated version of Genesis, of humans being damned, humans being cursed, humans being flawed, humans being separate from nature. And those stories fit actually incredibly well with hyper-rational atheistic science, actually. You can see the world in very similar ways, whether you're a Christian or whether you're an atheist. There's still some of those very similar stories, and we can get into some of those stories. I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
Yeah, I just think, one of the things just to kind of add on to that is, like, I think a lot of people think that, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment was a sloughing off of, like, all religion. But what Jake is kind of highlighting is that there was an epistemological foundation that didn't get removed, which is this idea that humans have the capacity to control nature. And it's hard to deny that kind of idea when you look around and, people talk about how we've been raising the temperature and climate change. And, we obviously have the ability to impact our environment tremendously. But that is going to lead to our ultimate destruction, and we're never going to be able to evade death. That's never going to happen. And so there are these fundamental things that are never going to, this idea that we're actually going to have dominion over the world is never going to come to fruition, because it's just like we're not that powerful, regardless of how much we've been able to colonize the world and how many of us there are and how much are, how these skyscrapers and these incredible feats that we've made. It's like, but I think what's really important for people to recognize is that the people who were in the Enlightenment, they were not rational atheists. They were also operating from this foundational operating system. So then when they have these experiences of doing experiments and learning about science and like really integrating that into their worldview, it still has this foundational narrative that we are in control here. And so then when, we get the ideas that the world is just basically a machine and that animals are basically just machines, and, Rene Descartes starts cutting up dogs to see how the mechanics work, and we start reducing everything down, it's still with this fundamental idea that comes from this quote of the Bible, is that we have the ability to control and subdue the world. So it's kind of multifaceted, because it's, the scientism that we're sort of bombarded with today, it still has this sort of religious core to it. And even still, science is just a story that we're telling ourselves about how to order and understand the world. It's just become our sort of bleak culture that, we're all kind of being forced to live within, that further, in my view, separates us from truly engaging in relationship with the living world.
Yeah, and as you say, they're not so far apart as one would think. One way of, I guess, saying is first comes the religion and says that this world is not sacred anymore. It's not sacred. God is somewhere far away from here. And then the next step is the resource for us to exploit, since it's not sacred. So I guess they dovetail pretty well together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think at the core there's the narrative that we are separate from the even this or the world around us, that there's distinctions and layers of separation make these stories possible, make this society possible, make so much. It's so interesting when you think about humans and what they're willing to do and not do because of the story they tell themselves. I have friends who you see it in just individual humans. We're so limited by what we do have going on in our heads, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, what we're capable of, what we're not capable of, what our culture is, what life is, what history was. It's hard to play with ideas if you think history was a certain way. If you believe certain things about history, well then life can be no other way. So it's such an interesting, when you allow yourself that freedom to question big premises that you couldn't identify as premises maybe early on in your life, but you start seeing premises being presented to you and you say, maybe that's true, or maybe it's not true, it's a very liberating thing.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the obsession of control in our culture, how close is that? There's this Greek word, I think you have it in English as well, hubris, yeah? I think hubris is also at the core of our culture. We see it now in its most extreme form in the transhumanism. I know you have also talked about that in your podcast, not respecting natural limits, for instance.
Yeah, I think the hubris is, like I was saying before, it's understandable because you look around us and the human world is so built and constructed around us. And so it's really easy for us to assume that we are in charge here. And, when most of our media is sort of based around just like human narratives and human stories, it's really easy to sort of get into this insular place of like living in a city and like not really having access to the mystery and the abundance of the living world. It's really easy to start having these ideas about that, not only is our culture superior to other cultures, but also that like I, as a human being, have more potential for consciousness than another being. And I think that, this idea of separating ourselves and putting ourselves above the rest of the living community, that, that comes from the great chain of being, which was also a religious point of view, which is that there's God, there's angels, there's humans, and then, there's everything below us. So it's like, we have to.
We just took out God and angels, and now we're at the top.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe one day we'll create machines that are able to govern us and better than we can govern ourselves, and we'll put the machines at the top, but it'll still fundamentally be us at the top because we created the machines, or, and so I think I wish I could better articulate where I think this hubris came from, but I think that it's, you once you're able to subdue something, you start to think of yourself as powerful. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's just been growing.
Well, and I think this comes back to the death topic as well, because the thing we're really running from is death, because death represents the ultimate uncontrollability of the universe. And I think humans have been on this huge quest. If we look at the rest of the web of life, literally every other species on Earth, they're here because whether it's a fruit fly or a cat or a bird, they've most likely been on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, for a reason, is because that species figured out how to integrate itself within the rest of the laws of life that govern the rest of life. Butterflies don't destroy their ecosystem. They make it actually more habitable for them. We talked to a regenerative farmer once, and he said, humans, kind of talking about modern humans, are the only species that doesn't directly benefit the matrix of life that supports its own existence. If you look at literally any other life form on Earth, its basic behavior of procuring food and surviving actually regenerates and makes the system it got that food from stronger. And so we're the only humans who don't, we're the only species culture really who doesn't do that. And so, and I think it's because we hate the fact that we can't control the laws of life, and that ultimately in those laws of life is written our own death. And we don't like that. We're the only species that's conscious of it, and that it makes us go insane. And so we are trying so hard to transcend all laws of life. But if we want to continue living as living beings, we have to play the game that is... There's this great quote from an author that we love. It goes, outlaws go extinct. Species go extinct all the time by their own doing, and it's because they can't play the laws of life. If you can't figure out how to live with the rest of life, then you just go extinct. So outlaws go extinct, and sooner or later, every outlaw goes extinct. But people who work within the laws could be on this planet for millions, if not billions of years as life forms. Very, very, I don't know about billions, but millions and millions of years for very long periods of time.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that just is kind of coming to me as we've been talking is like so few people anymore. And I think that this is changing, but I think that, at the earliest formations of our species, there was this sense of grandness of the world. You saw the stars and you saw the heavens every single night, and you knew like, wow, like I am humbled. I'm humble before the world. I'm humble before the living community. I'm humble before the creatures that I'm killing. I think that killing is a really important part of this. Is like, you have to be humble before when you take life and consume life and understand your role in that sort of ecosystem. And what has happened is that, we have light pollution, so we never see the heavens anymore. We don't kill for food, and we don't even think that we're killing things when we eat vegetables and like fruits and stuff. So, we've completely dissociated from that as well. But we don't have experiences that humble us. And I think the thing that I just keep thinking about, and I hope it's okay that I talk about this on your podcast, but taking like psilocybin mushrooms, that place that you enter where not only do you feel connected to everything around you, but you recognize the limitations of your ego, and you recognize that you are just this like, corporeal being that like is only here for a finite amount of time. And it feels really good to recognize that, actually. And you feel like it's maybe a little bit scary at first, but then you feel this like sense of liberation and humility before the rest of the world. I think that there's just so like the world has been constructed to make us believe that we're the only thing that actually matters. And then so it just keeps reinforcing this idea. And then, unless you have access to psychedelics, that might be the only experience that you ever have. Or like going on a camping trip, seeing the stars, being like, immersed in like a beautiful moment of nature might be the only experience of the sacred or divinity that you have ever experienced.
I mean, we were talking before this started about, how our phones are making us antisocial, and it's antisocial media. And the modern world is so good at, we never really have to think about what's real. We never really have to be confronted with kind of like the basic truths of what this existence is. Everybody can become an armchair philosopher and hypothesize of whether we live in a hologram or whatever it is. But pretty quickly, when you go to farms or you go out in the woods or you just think about what is going to happen to you is that you are going to die, then you kind of get to these basic core tenets of what it means to be alive and so if we can't even be honest and try to have those experiences about what's real, how the hell are we going to ever fix the climate problem? How are we ever going to build a planet that can sustain life if we can't confront that? And I didn't want to confront that when I was a vegan. That was the thing I was running from. I'm going to save the world, but I can still do it thinking that, these truths aren't true. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, I think if I'm not mistaken, in your documentary project, you slaughter an animal. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and hopefully Jake will do the same thing as well. But yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. I was writing about this the other day. When we started this project, I immediately knew, we both immediately knew, like, we're going to have to kill things in order to do this project and to do it fully and to be able to actually have this conversation. And the first time we ever saw a slaughter happen was at this bison farm in Texas. And I remember the feeling of witnessing that was so intense and so powerful, and just like this, it was a very transcendent experience, and it felt very sacred. And I really was like, this is an opportunity for me to really learn something. But I was really confronted by the weight of it and the responsibility. And I was like, I know that I'm going to have to do this. And I'm really scared. I'm really scared of what that's going to feel like. What if I kill something and I have to, I realize that it's horribly, horribly wrong. And I have to like quit the project, and I have to figure out how to live on this earth without killing things. But I'm worried about, like, I think that everything is alive. I think that everything is imbued with like holiness and spirit. So, I was really nervous about the concept of doing this. But then I had the opportunity at Fialbetta to slaughter a sheep. And, the experience was incredibly powerful, because the night previous to the slaughter, my mom called me and told me that my grandmother was dying. And so basically it was like I was going to have time to do the slaughter, and then I was going to have to get catch the train to Stockholm to fly home and see my grandmother die. And my grandmother is like, my grandma, she was my like best friend my whole life, like most important person in my life by far, like the woman who raised me. And so there was a real heaviness, but a real sense of like, I need to show up. Like, this is where you grow up, Maren. Like, it's time for you to grow up and put on your big girl hat and do what you have to do. And so I was really lucky to have the opportunity to slaughter one of Jürgen's older ewes, who, Maya, who was the shepherdess at the time, she told me that, at a certain, like, soon her teeth were going to start falling out. She hadn't lambed in a few years. Like, but she was a healthy sheep, but, she'd lived a long life, and she, that was the ewe that was chosen. And I had the experience, and we were able to film it for the film, and it was so unbelievably powerful and enriching. And I was just so grateful. I was so grateful to have that experience. And I was so confronted, but with so much reverence and gratitude, that it's like, one day I'm going to be food for somebody else too. And that's an honor. That's an honor. And I think that people don't want to think that. We put our dead bodies in caskets and want to pretend like they don't exist, and we don't let ourselves be food for anybody else because we think we're above it. And so I'm sure that a lot of people would think that it's messed up that I killed an animal, but I know I'm going to kill again, and I'm going to kill a lot of things in my life, and I do every day by existing, because fundamentally, like, that's something that I can't avoid, is that in order for me to live, other things have to die. And I can either do that with reverence and respect and intentionality, or I can just pretend like it doesn't exist and have like a less rich life from it. But it was a really beautiful experience. And I was so, so grateful for being in the presence of something like that, and knowing that I had the responsibility. And then that I got to feed my friends for a winter, even though I didn't really I only had the chance to eat the heart and the liver before I had to leave. But yeah, I guess, do you feel like I explained that well?
Yeah, that's great. I think we've witnessed a number of animal deaths and slaughters and participated in butchering during the scope of this project, because we wanted to know, we had to know what it was like. We had to, I had never been in the presence of an animal dying and being butchered and slaughtered. And we've done it a number of times now and gotten our hands dirty and really tried to be as intimate with that experience as possible, so that we could never lie to ourselves about the next time we ate meat, what that meant. Because it changes you. It does. You can never look at animal foods again the same way. And it made me a better person, and it made me more thoughtful, and it made me more intentional, and it has changed my behavior on a day-to-day basis because of those experiences. They're very valuable. And I think people don't experience death. People very rarely, some people get the gift of experiencing a close one to them die, and they get to be there, and it gets to be sometimes a very meaningful experience, but quite often it doesn't. Sometimes it's kind of a insulated, sanitized experience. And death doesn't change us. Death doesn't influence our day-to-day lives, because we don't have to deal with it ever.
And Jürgen told me, like we were talking about both the sheep and my grandma, but he just told me like every death is an opportunity, and you get to decide how you show up and what you do with that opportunity. And so, the thing that I realized after I killed the sheep was that it wasn't wrong that I killed it. What's wrong is that not every single sheep dies like that. When it's quick, painless, lights out, immediate, the blood goes into the land that it's been living on, and its community gets to be stronger because that sheep lived and because the humans around it were enriched by its life and its death. And so that's where I get really passionate, is like what the vegan ideology wants to just pretend like this doesn't exist and that we don't need it anymore, that we've evolved beyond this thing and that somehow we can escape it. And I think that it's something that we have, if we actually want justice for animals and we actually want human justice and like spiritual justice and just like a sense of belonging in the world, we have to take responsibility for this thing and we have to lean in. That's in order to engage with your ecology, you have to engage with the death that is required for that ecology to function. And so that's just our point of view, is that like, and it doesn't mean that it's easy. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so important. The fear of death is really something which separates us from indigenous cultures. When I was writing my book, I read for the research, Helen Ellerby wrote a book called The Dark Side of Christian History. Maybe she gives an extremely dark view, but one thing she talks about is in the early centuries of Christianity, one of the most sort of important campaigns they had was to sort of completely exterminate the notion of reincarnation, which most early Christians had. And also an experienced indigenous view of time as something cyclical. Instead, you have this linear view, and your road either goes to hell or paradise. So it's just a highway to death, and death is terminal. So I think that is very important, and probably you could argue that it's a way of controlling people also, by having the death should be something dark and fearful and as I say, I don't think it's the same way for most indigenous people.
Exactly. I think something we've said a lot lately is there's worse things than death. And I think we're told to believe the opposite. Because if there's the big fear, if there's the big thing that we all have to be, that will change our behavior if we're threatened with it, that's a very powerful thing to have us so afraid of that thing. But I think there's worse things than death. And I think you're right. So many, as we've looked at it too, I wouldn't say that indigenous cultures don't have as strong of a response to death. It's just that they've integrated it in their world. Death, I think, will always be scary. And I think we'll always obviously be trying to avoid it and abate it. And it is something that is sad and it's hard to watch people we love die. But I feel like they did a better job of accepting those hardships and integrating it into how they lived their lives. And they were more wise about feeling those things and having that be part of their day-to-day lives.
Yeah. And, I was just thinking as you were speaking is like, this is actually something that we know. Like, we know that there are worse things in life than death. That's why we put our dogs down, when they get to a point where they have no dignity and you're like, oh my God, this dog needs to die. Like, this dog's quality of life is horrible. And so we euthanize them. And the word euthanize means good death in Greek, but when we deny that death is just part of the passage onto wherever we go. We have no idea. It is final and it is brutal and it's painful. But I since doing this project, me and my family have had to put down 3 pets, like old pets in our lives. And I was lucky enough to be there for all of them. But in one of them, I was holding this little dog, that lived a really good life, like for a dog. And she was loved and she was cared for, and getting to hold her and see how peaceful that was. That's a really, really beautiful thing. And so we know that death offers respite to the old. We know that. Everybody who has old people that they love and care about, you see them get to a place where you want them to be free of their body, and you want them to be free of the pain of being in their corporeal body that's withering away and dying. And so I think that what what gets in the way of us knowing that and having that awareness is the fact that we look and we're afraid of old people because we don't want to think that that's going to be me one day, whether I'm, I die in a bus accident or something like in 2 minutes or 2 hours, or I die as an old woman. I think that we don't view death as an opportunity because we don't want to have to face the fact that that's going to be us one day too.
So before we wrap up, I just wanted to, I think what we have touched upon here is that in the mainstream media, we're still being fed this sort of front line between right and left in politics. And we can see when we talk about things like, the manipulations around climate change and big agriculture, they can play both hands very well. I was wondering, because I used to be very loyal with the left, and I think they still have a lot of good points. You follow the money, then you find power. But I just want to read you a short quote from the book that I'm finishing. I talk about Karl Marx described capital as a force hostile to life, that it was something that, like cancer, can only grow and accumulate as life and its diversities are depleted. He predicted that capitalism would eventually tear apart the fabric of life and turn everything, including man, into a commodity. But even Marx was shaped by the dominator culture, and communism, just like capitalism, sees nature primarily as something to be mastered and overcome. Both isms are anthropocentric and based on the idea of large-scale industrial systems that do not develop in harmony with other species on the planet. According to the indigenous worldview, industrial societies can never be long-term sustainable, let alone democratic in any deeper sense.
So good.
Well
that says
done.
it all
I love
right
it.
there. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. If I could just say, this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is these, especially over the past 3 years, it's hard to avoid the ists and the isms. And, everybody is like, the internet culture has really caused us to sort of bio ourselves as like a handful of words to describe ourselves. And so, often I think that that's just another way of us forcing, commodifying ourselves and reducing ourselves down to a descriptor that continues to separate us from each other. And it creates more polarization. If I say that I'm a communist, everybody who's not a communist instantly doesn't want to talk to me. Even if what I have to say is good, even if what I have to say is resonant. But yeah.
Yeah, I love that quote because it's, that's something we've just been joking around. It's been like this recurring joke, and I think in our relationship where it's like we meet another communist and it's like, oh, come on, man. It's like you're saying about the left where it's like, yeah, Marx in communism, there's a lot good there. There's a lot to point to that's like, yeah, we should obviously be doing that thing, but you still haven't addressed the keystone problem. You haven't gotten to the epistemology. It's just like, it's like, oh, so instead of one person running the factory, it's like we're all running the factory, but there's still the factory, man. And we still have to work in a factory. It's still running on the exact same premises. It's just mildly more equal.
Yeah.
But, and again, I think that's the most important thing we want to, if somebody sees our documentary or reads what our research and some of the essays Maren's doing, it's like, we don't need anybody to think we're right or win an argument. It's just like, I want people to start questioning those assumptions, because what we need now more than ever is a mass of people who are willing to see, to identify that epistemology, to identify the core stories. And maybe they think those stories are still good stories to tell themselves. That's up to you. But I think until we get people to really think about this, like, wow, yeah, there is like these recurring themes, just like as you've elucidated between, capitalism and communism. It's like we have to get people to have that muscle to start identifying the epistemology that underlines everything. And I think that starts with us showing people, there's stories that get told over and over and over, and you don't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
So, my father used to ask, how do we go from here to there? There's a lot of very powerful corporatocracy, corporations and institutions running this planet. But how would you view these times we're living through right now? I know a lot of people lot of my friends, and they say that, well, this is a scary time, but they wouldn't want to go back to 2019. They still think this is a fascinating time to be alive. And so how do you see this in closing? Yeah.
What I'm grateful for is that the past 3 years have really encouraged me to step back and try to see things from as large of a view as I can and create this mosaic of understanding, so that I'm no longer being sucked into the left versus right kind of things that kind of keep us really stuck, I think. And so what I think that it's so hard because it's like you can't, it's hard to give prescriptions about where we go from here. But I think for me personally, taking a step back and really sitting with the the discomfort and the anxiety and the fears and the grief that I felt about, the direction that the world is going, and being really, really honest about that, and being honest about what really trying to get in tune with what do I think about the world, and having discernment and intuition about what I'm witnessing. It's been a very lonely process in a lot of ways, but on the other side of it is like I've met so many amazing people who I can actually have these really important conversations with. And so it's like going into the grief has like helped me be optimistic. Going into myself and feeling alienated from the culture has allowed me to find the people who really like understand and uplift me and inspire me. And so I feel that it is a scary time to live in, and it's hard when we have so many forces against us that want to continually atomize us. What we need to do is we just need to keep kind of coming back to what makes us human. And one of the things that makes us human is relationships with each other. It's talking, it's having conversations, it's telling stories. And in order to do that, we have to stop dehumanizing each other on the internet. Like, we have to stop having this like really reductionist view of one another. And so that's what's on my mind right now.
I mean, I flip-flop between when I look at the global picture between being like having reasons of being optimistic, but also like there's definitely the part of me that understands that like the universe was perfectly fine letting an asteroid hit the Earth when the dinosaurs were here, and the universe will be perfectly fine letting us kill ourselves. So I think that's for me. It's like I try to accept that it's still it's a reality that we could like really continue to fuck shit up, and it could get worse, So I flip flop, but we've had a lot of conversations like, well, what if you do just have a sense that like things are probably going to get really bad before they get better? What do you do with that? And we have this friend who wrote a great book called Civilized to Death. And he says in that book, if there's going to be a crash landing, try really hard for it to be a crash landing rather than just a crash. If the engine cuts out, see if you can't glide that thing in it's going to be a rocky crash, but some of you might walk away from it. We also had another friend recently tell us, my cat is saying hi, that there has to be a forest fire for the seedlings to hatch in the deep soil. But the important thing is those seeds have to be there. Mm-hmm. So if there is going to be a forest fire, you make sure you've planted some seeds that need that fire underneath. And so I think if I'm going to like hedge my bets, I'm trying to plant seeds. I'm trying to, we've traveled a lot, we've researched a lot, and we really went deep in industrial civilization. We didn't just play with it. Like we committed. We very much committed to industrializing this planet, and we've done a very good job of it. And there's actually very little intact ecosystem anywhere on Earth. It's still there, but there's very little. You'd be so shocked when you look at it. We have a lot of monocultured forests. We have a lot of greenery, but it's not ecosystems. And so I get to this place where I'm like, well, it's very likely that this actually ends in a really bad place. But what can I best do to create lifeboats? What can I do to best plant the seeds? Because the last thing I would want is for there to be a forest fire and nothing to come up from that, nothing that comes next, no rebirth from that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where my head's at. I'm a little bit more pessimistic, but I'm optimistic, and then there are things you can do to make it better. Yeah. You can make that crash a little bit better.
Yeah, because I think the crash is coming. This way of life can't sustain itself, and I don't see capitalism having an epiphany one day to just like decide to cease to exist. Like it's just not going to happen, and people are so dependent on it. And so I think really the best thing that individuals can do is try to try to plant seeds, try to learn as much as they can, and to like not only learn from history, but learn from, like learn skills that will benefit you, learn skills that you can pass down to your children, learn, there's so many things
practical things,
like practical, like how to be in the earth, how to live here, how to like exist. And like, we're very, very domesticated as a species. Just like our domesticated animals have been very like, they're lacking an essence of what helps them survive inherently. And we need to, in a lot of ways, undomesticate ourselves. And that's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of practice and energy. But that's a way that we can be really responsible for our role here on Earth, rather than just assuming that you can just buy a Tesla and like call it a day, So
if that makes any sense. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up. Just before we say goodbye, can you just tell us a bit more about your work and where people can find you?
Fantastic. Yeah. So we're pretty much everywhere as just one word, Death in the Garden. We're on Substack, which is mostly Maren's writing, which is really, really good. And we're turning it all into like audio. Like Maren's a great writer. So if you want to read stuff, it's there. And then you can listen to a lot of it as well. Our podcast is Death in the Garden, and our Instagram is Death in the Garden. Our Twitter is Death_the_Garden.
Yeah.
Our website's deathinthegarden.org. Please reach out. Please say hi. And thank you so much for having us. Anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to talk about these awesome, amazing ideas, and, just feeling like we can have a really wonderful and generative conversation. So thank you for creating the space for that.
Well, thank you. Pleasure is all mine.
Hey,
so
thank you so
take
much.
care and hope to see you again.
Yes,
Absolutely.
thank you. Bye-bye.